To the forum at 8 here on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. Well, yesterday then, Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan presenting his budget, and this on the back of a lot that's been said about how difficult this one is likely to be given the sluggish economic growth, the declining tax revenues, the widening budget deficit, higher debt levels, and so on. And the minister joining us here on the program this morning just to give us some more clarity, give us some more meat, given the budget yesterday. A very good morning to you, Minister. I really thank you very much for your time.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having us.
Thanks indeed. Well, also joining us to look at the budget is Brian Cantor. He is with Investec Wealth and Investment. Thank you very much, Brian. Good to see you again.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Also on the program this morning, Mr. Fred Jacobs is the Chamber President, the Cape Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Jacobs, good morning.
Good morning, and welcome to your list.
Thank you very much for your time. Perhaps I should start with Brian. Brian, and the reason why I'm starting with you is simply because pundits ahead of this budget had said that it's going to be one of the toughest for the minister, and they were pleasantly surprised, were you not? I suppose it's time to congratulate the minister, is it not?
Yes, I was very pleased that the minister and his colleagues saw fit not to raise tax rates. I think that was very helpful. The economy really does not deserve higher tax rates, and hopefully the budget will play its part in stimulating some growth, which is really essential to some more growth, which is essential to the purpose, as the minister, I'm sure, would agree.
And maybe that's a good point then to bring in the minister to say, but how did you avoid raising taxes? Because everyone was pretty much expecting taxes to go up, given the environment that I've just painted, the adverse global economic environment.
No, because we're very kind and generous people.
Very kind of you.
No, it's been a tough act, and we certainly appreciate the fact that most people have realized that this was a phenomenal balancing act by government to make sure that on the one hand we undertake expenditure cuts and moderation without hurting poor people in South Africa or the economy more generally, and at the same time avoiding unnecessary tax hikes. But at the same time, we've also been very frank with the country. In October last year, during the medium-term budget policy statement, we said, look, things don't look good. The growth could be declining. We've had certain events in the mining and other sectors in South Africa which could impact upon tax revenue. And we were right. So today we can report that we are likely to lose some 16 billion rands in revenue. And that the growth is not going to be 2.7%, it's 2.5% for 2012. At the same time, we can say that, look, the prospects ahead might be a little bit better than what it was in 2012.
And in order to make up, sorry, yeah.
Just one last point. Yeah. And the focus on growth is the key issue. Now, where you perhaps want to take Brian to is that it's not government alone that can stimulate growth. A point that I've just made to Mr. Jacobs' associates in the chamber is that governments since about 2007, 2008 around the world have in fact replaced the private sector as key drivers of growth in most parts of the world. As the bigger Eastern economies, India and China, have replaced the Western economies as the drivers of global growth. And the key question that many are asking is, when does the handover to the private sector happen?
Yeah.
When does the private sector, which is more than 70% of the economy in South Africa, become the driver of investment, the driver of job creation, and the driver of growth? And so the key challenge for us in South Africa is government having played its part and continuing to play its part in stimulating the economy, in ensuring that there's macroeconomic stability, in undertaking the structural changes, although we've still got many to tackle. When does the private sector come on board and invest in the way they should?
Let's pick up on that point then, Minister. And maybe we should start, and I'm going to come to you, Brian. I know you want to say something, and Mr. Jacobs wants to say something in a minute. Let's talk about whether or not then the budget creates conducive environment for business to come on board, for investors to come on board. And I'm going to start with something that may seem small, but important, because we've heard businesses talk about it: electricity tariffs. NERSA today will be announcing their decision on the 16% that the Eskom has asked for. Businesses are very much opposed to it, and we didn't hear much of it yesterday, Minister.
let's take the electricity tariff.
Yeah.
For many years in South Africa, one of our competitive advantages was cheap electricity.
It was.
And that was because there was a positive gap between supply of electricity and use of electricity in our economy. That gap has disappeared and the balance has shifted, where you have had growth levels in South Africa that didn't get compensated by the right level of investment in the electricity generation sector in particular. So there were mistakes made or judgment calls made 10, 12 years ago, which are impacting upon us today. Secondly, tariffs can only decrease if we can find some money to put into Eskom to assist in building the new power stations and improving generation capacity. Where do you find that money? So you don't want tax rates to go up. You don't want the revenue base to increase through growth. So where do you find the money? Some would say, well, change the way in which the private sector becomes involved in this process. And that's certainly something that we've begun to look at on the renewable side of energy. It's something that we need to examine as we go forward on the other side as well. So we understand very well that tariffs cannot impose an additional burden on business, particularly those sections of business that are energy intensive. But the longer term question for South Africans, all of us, government and business, is how do we ensure that we are not as energy intensive as we are in South Africa?
Mr. Jacobs, and this is for your members, because your members would like something that will incentivize them in order for them to go back and invest in this economy. They will be looking today to hear what NASA has got to say about this electricity tariff and how government makes it easy for them to come back and do what exactly the minister says. Go back to the economy, create jobs, lead this growth.
Let's start with NERSA. We say that we don't say...
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, loud and clear. Go
Okay.
ahead, please.
We're not saying no to increases. What we are saying no to are the level of increases. And our submission to NERSA has been very clearly framed. And we've asked Mr. Damas to look at things more holistically, to look at the societal impact. So we understand increases are necessary. We won't fight against that. But we are delighted, and we call the minister's budget a responsible budget. I mean, giving back is always good.
Yeah.
The 7 billion is more than welcome. So thank you very much, Minister Gordhan. We're delighted to hear about the fact that the cost of business is being reduced. SMMEs need that. I mean, they are the job creators. And particularly our members, we have some 3,000 of them, 60% of them are small businesses. So we're looking at reducing the cost of doing businesses. We're looking forward to the simplification of access to resources, particularly financial. And yes, that'll help.
But how can that happen? In what shape should that take, the simplification of access to resources such as financial?
Well, first of all, it's looking at what government agencies can assist. And this is not abdicating our responsibility in business, the larger companies. We're looking at ways of actually assisting the smaller companies.
So in other words, efficiency in as far as these government agencies are concerned.
Absolutely. We're looking at, and the minister has, and I will give him credit, he has in fact spoken about efficiency and productivity and a more effective deployment of both the human and financial resources within the civil service. And that is really going to be helping us. I might just add, of course, that the enabling environment is important. And we take up the challenge, Minister, as far as the private sector is concerned. We are co-partners in this. We've got to do this together. And then, you know, I think the one lesson, if I might just take this opportunity, is it's wonderful to have a 1% cost of collection. And we're hoping, and the minister has indicated this, that the rest of government will look at the way the National Treasury is collecting money. And therefore, they should be running their departments in a similar way. The key to all of this, to your listeners, from a chamber perspective, is implementation, and we look forward to that.
And that is very key, Brian, is it not? The implementation issue. And let me give you the context in which I'm saying this, because it's one thing for the minister to cut expenditure by about 10 billion, but the issue is whether or not the departments will comply, and are we not going to see overshoots as well? Are we not going to see overspending, even though the minister has said cut down?
Well, that is an issue skeptics will raise, that the minister will be unable to meet his expenditure targets, particularly holding down improved spending or remuneration, as well as improved numbers in the public sector. But let me just address what I think is a confusion here. When we're talking about cuts, we're talking about lower rates of growth. We're not talking about cuts in the level of spending or revenue. Both are up substantially, including revenue. I mean, it should be appreciated that while the minister didn't raise tax rates, he is also going to collect something like
so it is not
100 billion more in revenue this year over last year.
Yeah.
But he's managed to hold down the increase in spending relative to the increase in revenue.
But the key is whether or not that will happen, Minister. Whether or not.
Well, that is the charge, I think. Well, reassure us that these expenditure targets will be in fact met. I think that will be the question in many people's minds.
Which also touches on the issues of efficiency of agencies, Minister.
If you have 10 rands in your pocket, you can't spend 12 rands.
But it has happened with departments.
No, it might have happened in the odd place. In fact, the bigger challenge in government is underspending, particularly on capital expenditure. And that's the challenge that we are overcoming, whether it's schools delivery, health infrastructure delivery, roads delivery, and particularly at a provincial level. So I don't think that we should move into the skeptic mode. And one of the challenges about the way some of these conversations happen is no sooner have you dealt with one issue, then you have skepticism about another issue. And no sooner have you dealt with that one, then you have skepticism about another one. So we can't work on this basis of continuous skepticism. If we don't change those mindsets, analysts are analysts. They've got to look for fault lines all the time to write about. What our business is to create positivity in this environment, to do the right things that need to be done, to continually improve the way in which government works, to continually create a basis for better partnership between labor, business and government in the first instance, but also to gain the confidence of citizens that all of us are doing the right things. And for us, that's the key. So we've made the bold measures to make sure that we moderate, and Brian is absolutely right, to moderate the growth in expenditure. I said earlier on that when the good days were around and the economy was growing at 4 and 5%, revenue was being collected at quite a hectic rate. We were able to give huge tax cuts for citizens and for corporates as well. Remember, the corporate rate in South Africa, 10 years ago was about 35%, if not more, and we've come a long way to 28% as we sit there now. And in those days, the growth in spending was 9 to 11% real. So you still had inflation to that.
Yeah.
In October, we bring it down to 2.9% last year. Now we've brought it down to 2.3%. So yes, we are moderating growth. We are not cutting expenditure beyond that level because we don't want austerity measures in South Africa.
That's a very interesting point. Again, let me pick up on it, Brian, because to what extent does it affect this economic growth anyway, just moderating on expenditure? Because government plays a very important role in terms of spending and so on. To what extent does it then affect plans to grow this economy?
We've made our cuts in a way in which the core programs, whether they're economic support programs like the manufacturing competitiveness package, or the new incentives we're putting in for special economic zones, or the incentives that go to the motor industry, the textile industry, the depreciation allowance that businesses have, all of that actually costs us tens of billions of rands every year. Often we don't talk about those things, but those numbers are in this book. And those are important contributions, none of which have been cut. The key social services have not been cut. We are looking for cuts in areas where there is slow delivery, or where there are programs that don't seem to be moving in the right direction, and where the money can be redirected elsewhere, which any normal business would do.
Brian, you wanted to say something?
Yes, well, I just wanted to get back to growth. I don't think it's entirely fair to say the business sector hasn't contributed to growth in recent years in South Africa. It has, but the environment has been difficult for business as well as government, perhaps to a degree. But we want to encourage confidence with business, confidence of business to invest in the future.
But why is business not confident? I mean, the minister says we've done everything we can. We've created an enabling environment.
Well, the mining sector is under particular duress. The industrial sector, I think, has been producing pretty good results, and we do see significant reinvestment. We've seen investment plans. The minister referred to them by any
Actually,
number
he did,
of leading businesses, and that's good news. As far as South Africa's costs of servicing its debt, which are rising, the deficit was 5.2. It's intended to come down, not go up. And the minister stuck to the plan to bring that deficit down to 3% in 2015. I think that's a very important commitment. We have to get back. Otherwise, you raise more debt, you spend more money paying interest. It really doesn't get you anywhere. You have to try and live within your means, which I would say, and the minister seemed to agree, was to cut back on the growth in spending.
Would you have cut more, Brian? Would you, or the growth on spending, given the debt to GDP ratio?
Well, we could have cut more, but this is not an austerity budget. We shouldn't think of this as an austerity. It is anything but an austerity budget, appropriately so. We don't want an austerity budget given the state of our economy. We don't want to see government contracting deeply at this time, but in due course, the essential discipline will be to hold back on government spending, which has to be financed by taxpayers.
All right. Let me do this. The minister will respond in a minute, but also open the lines on 0891 104 208, 0891 104 208. I've got a lot of SMSs coming through at 34701 also. But let me take a commercial break. When we come back, then we'll hear more from my guests, but also hear from the listeners. What do they think about the budget presented yesterday here in Cape Town?
The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
All right, we're talking about the budget, yesterday's budget delivered here in Parliament, but I think I would like to pick up on the point that we were just making off air now about what would be an acceptable debt level. We're at about, what, 40.3%? You said, Minister, yesterday.
Just around 40.
Debt to GDP ratio, 40.3%. But what would be an acceptable one, Brian?
Well, in terms of the European agreements and their fiscal stability pacts, they would say no more than 60%.
Yeah, but obviously you're talking about countries, for instance, Greece, which is over 100.
Yeah.
You're talking about Italy, also over 100. For us, a developing country, what would be an acceptable figure?
Well, I think 40% should not cause any concern.
45?
Not especially, but you would want to see those debt ratios come down as the economy grows faster and delivers more revenue. I mean, one critique you could make of economic policy over the years, in the good years, the fat years, we didn't pay off our debt as fast, perhaps, as we should have. That we allowed spending to grow rapidly rather than to run down our debt. But at this stage, given the state of the global and the South African economy, you wouldn't be looking to reduce your debt to GDP ratios. You'd be looking to encourage growth. And I think, in a way, the minister and his team have pretty much got that right.
Do you think that government must be given a leeway of just increasing that debt a little bit more than 40%? Because clearly everyone gets concerned, and fiscal discipline and ratings agencies and so on.
Yeah, this is what we would call in colloquial terms a dicey question. I think there's a relationship between debt levels and growth levels. If an economy is growing, then it is producing more revenue. If it's producing more revenue, it has more credibility in terms of being able to pay its debt.
Yeah.
It's like you borrowing from a bank for a house, a car, or whatever it is that you want to buy. You become a credible creditor if your income levels are rising. And then the bank will say to you, you can borrow more because I know that you're earning more and you can pay more. Now, in our case, we need to get the growth levels going, which might then create space for us to borrow more, because we have a more credible picture as far as our critics are concerned and some of the institutions that actually watch us. And that's why in the budget, growth is a key focus area, and the participation of the private sector. So if you look at the 2012 numbers in the budget review, you can see that government, particularly through the public corporations, made a huge investment over the last few years versus the private sector, which has retreated. We need to get that balance right in terms of investment. As far as confidence is concerned, confidence is a two-way game. And in South Africa, we face more problems than most countries would in terms of building confidence. My view would be that we need a different take on the way we calculate risk in South Africa, that maybe we're too risk averse. So if you take Mr. Jacobs' earlier point about access of small and medium-sized businesses to finance, it's the financial institutions that must come to the party. This is not government's business. Government can fill some kind of gap, but ultimately the role of banks is to assist the real economy businesses to grow, to expand, to create more jobs, and to become profitable, and innovate in the right kind of way as well. So if we can get the growth and debt picture right, then we have actually more space to assist, whether it's electricity generation in South Africa or anything else.
We'll talk about that in a while. But Mr. Jacobs, let me bring you in before I take the news headlines.
Yes.
Yeah, your thoughts on what the minister is saying. Yeah, that we may sometimes be a little more risk averse than elsewhere.
I think there is a degree of conservatism, and I think that we need to look at our mindset.
But what is the basis of that? And I know it may sound a little like I'm digressing, but part of our problem in this country has always been this lack of this trust deficit, some people say, between all the social partners, labor, government, and business. Could that be the reason?
Part of the reason, in fact, maybe a major part of the reason when one looks at society and in a developing democracy such as South Africa, it's not unnatural, in my book, to have these differences emerging. All right. And I think, you know, to use an expression, Rome was never built in a day. And yes, we're 19 years down the road from our democracy. I am still very bullish about the future. And if we continue having approaches by our finance ministry, our national treasury, the way that things are going at the moment, I'm pretty confident that things will get better. And I think
that business will come to the party.
Business will come to the party. I think FDI, which Brian has referred to, is incredibly important. I work with a lot of overseas shareholders, and their concern is always, and yes, they do look at the rating agencies, but as we heard last night at a dinner the minister was, the question is, do we look at the rating agencies or do you look at the bondholders? Why did they buy 90 billion, foreigners buy 90 billion rands of South African bonds last year?
Well, let's leave that question right as is, and we'll ask Brian to see if he can respond to that question. But I need to take the news headlines, Brian. Just hold your thoughts there. I'll need to take the headlines, and when I come back, then of course we'll continue and take some more calls on 0891104208.